Now, I mentioned last night that a lot of people had gone to, some of them very distinguished and senior people, had gone to the most extraordinary amount of trouble to arrange flights, transfer meetings and so forth to get here today. One of those, I hope, may be in the room or is about to walk into the room, fresh from Heathrow, is Cosmin Corendea. We haven't had a chance to say hello or even meet before, but as he races down the steps, straight off the aeroplane, he's going to give us the next talk. And in terms of the blending of disciplines, Cosmin has not only come from India, he's come from a law school, which is a different perspective. So you've just walked into the room, your heart is beating, you're breathing heavily, but the stage is yours. Cosmin.
Yes. Oh, hi. Hello, everyone. I apologize for just stepping out of the plane, literally, after 48 hours of Qatari drama. Can you hear me? Okay. So, my name is Cosmin Corendea. I'm a lawyer by making, but I'm a professor at Jindal University School of Law, which is in Delhi, and I have a previous experience quite... should I use this? Okay. Hello? Okay. So, yeah, and previously I worked for the United Nations for 7 years before I took a break and decided to have an Indian year, which I'm in the middle of it, and I'm enjoying the maximally, although sometimes it's very, risky to travel from there, which is supposed to be easy. So, I don't know how many lawyers you have in the room, but you're wondering why you have a lawyer here. There is a reason behind it, obviously, and mainly because there is a connection between the legal aspects, if you want, of climate change, human mobility, and conservation. And this is not only reflected in international documents, in international law, which I will not bother you with, because it's quite boring sometimes, but it's all reflected in policy. And I believe that from moving the research from academia into action, it means mostly to move it into policy making. And I strongly believe, and I am a very, very hard supporter of the influences academics, scholars, and students through their articles and their writing contributions can actually have to this topic. And once you start developing and start reading about it, you are actually learning that there is a lot out there. From the legal perspective, international law is quite abundant from this perspective in regards to policies and, as I told you, conventions, treaties, international law in general, but as well articles. A lot of articles and a lot of book chapters. I look into a little bit in the conservation area because I'm not a conservation expert. I should say that from the beginning, just to be on the safe side. And I think that there is the link. It's quite obvious, and mostly, I mean, I'm pretty sure that most of you have already worked and you are aware of the link between climate change and conservation, how conservation is influencing the climate change patterns and how the climate change patterns or the climate change events or the environmental events with climate change elements, to be literally correct, could influence the conservation processes. And sometimes it gets into development, sometimes unfortunately it gets into maldevelopment, in the wrongly approachable and wrongly implemented development. But at the end of the day, I think they are extremely connected, and they have the third link, which goes to what I call a subsidiary effect, which is human mobility. How is human mobility influencing conservation and climate change, and how is conservation and climate change influencing human mobility? This, from the policy-making perspective, depends where you want to have this conversation. You want to have this conversation in a conservation fora, like this one, and tackle human mobility and climate change issues from the conservation perspective, or you want to bring that conservation in the climate change fora under the UNFCCC, and we did that briefly under the Paris Agreement in 2015, or more recently, last December, we have a new global compact on migration, safety and orderly migration, which is the latest policy in relation to mobility as a subsidiary effect, as I was saying, from climate change events. Human mobility has 3 stages. I'm sorry, 3 elements. The first element will be migration. And although there is apparently hysteria in regards to migration, especially from Europe, I'm from Romania, so I'm European myself, and we are scared because of the media threatening us that the migrants are coming. Migration proved for 2,000 years to be an extremely positive event. And we want to positively influence that and positively path that, if you want, in order to make sure that migration stays. We, at the end of the day, more or less, all of us are migrants. We are coming from migrants, and this is actually which brings the values and traditions which you all share today, regardless where we are coming from. What we want to address, however, is the forced migration, where people do not have a choice to move, also known as displacement, where people feeling trapped and they are incapacitated, becoming incapacitated to actually take the decision to move. And this in relation to climate change, it's already in high numbers. We had 36 million last year, people who were forced displaced due to climate change events, and apparently this will reach more or less 200 million by 2050. And as we all know, the scientific projections usually are more relaxed than actually the events in real life, so probably the number will be more or less even higher than that. So it is here, displacement is here, and it's here to stay. Migration is here as well. And even if we don't experience it exactly like climate change, one day or later probably we're gonna have to face that. In regards to the third element, which is the relocation process, or also known as resettlement, with a component of evacuation, where people are actually relocated. They choose together with the state in order to relocate due to climate change events. Usually the climate change events are irreversible, like coastal erosion, like salinization, sea level rise, especially on the small island states all over the world, or the coastal parts of the continents. But the state here has a very active role to play, and this is where the state has the capacity to do that. Usually, unfortunately, as you all know, the most affected communities by climate change are the poorest, the isolated, women, elderly, children. According to IPCC, the latest reports 1.5 degrees from last November. This is the target where climate change can be seen and can be lived firstly. And these are also the communities who are actually forced to move, although they do not want to, or decide eventually to relocate. And you have events of relocation coming from United States to the Pacific Islands, to African continent, to Asia. So all over the place, these people, even in the UK, you have people moving from coastal inland, mainly because the coastal is not sustainable anymore. So this is in a nutshell what the elements of human mobility are, and how you link this to different climate change events. And this is done through what we know as a hybrid approach. A hybrid approach shows that if a climate change event happens, the first impact will be a human right violation, a human right breach. Some people somewhere in that part of the world are getting their human rights violated. I'm using the easy example of floods as a scientifically proven climate change event, just again to be on the safe side. And when you have floods, for example, and you have people who are living in a community which is affected by floods, and the state is not very active in adaptive or mitigation actions, then you have, for example, if you have people who cannot go to the pharmacy to buy medicine, you have the right to health. If you have elderly, you have the right to life. If you have children who cannot go to school due to floods, you have the right to education, and so on and so on. So a lot of human rights are being breached by the climate change event. And as I told you from the beginning, the subsidiary effect will be migration, will be what we know as mobility. And this is where the people have actually two choices to react to this climate event, is to adapt or to flee. The numbers which I did research upon until 2016 were a global number of 30% and increasing. So probably this number of 30% of people deciding to move immediately after the climate change occur would probably increase in the future as well. The adaptation decision of the household, of the people or community affected by climate change, it's in straight relation with the state capacity to assist, with the state capacity to provide protection to those people, firstly, and secondly, to provide means of adaptation. And if in the floods, maybe some sandbanks or better infrastructure could actually help. When it's coming to more complicated climate change events, things are getting complicated as well for the state. And again, you see this more in the states which do not have the capacity to assist financially or human resources, depending on the lack they are facing, they do not have the capacity to do that. So this is where the migrants are, the climate migrants are coming from, and this is where they have to go to look for better opportunities. It is scientifically proved that the first decision of the migrants to go has an economic connotation. And this is obviously related to the possibility to support that community, that household, when the climate change event occurs. But besides the economic component, you can have a medical component. You are trying to access better medical resources. You can have an educational component. You are accessing better educational systems for your children, and so on. If you have relatives over cross-border in particular, for example, then it's another opportunity for you to migrate. But again, the main difference here is between the choice, the free choice to move, which belongs to the people and they do own it, and the choice which is not entirely theirs. And as I said, in the climate change events, unfortunately, the choice does not stay with the people at all times. And this is actually the climate change issue, the climate change displacement problem, which is also reflected in Article 8 of the Paris Agreement and also reflected in the Global Compact, which came out last December and I just briefly told you about. And it makes this connection clearly between environmental degradation, disasters, climate change, and everything else, and human mobility with the elements I just elaborated. My title of the presentation is Continuum, and because I had a lot of time in the last 48 hours, I look in the dictionary to see if I remember correctly what continuum means from the law school. And I looked in an Oxford dictionary, not Cambridge dictionary, and it says that it's a continuous sequence in which adjacent elements are not perceptibly different, but the extremes are quite different. So it is the same case with conservation and climate change. They are related. You may probably more and more will not may talk about conservation without relating to climate change events, because either way it will affect one another. But the effects are a little bit different if you are taking the human non-human component. But at the end of the day, it also affects our lives per total. So if you are not making the differentiation between these two, then it will affect our life continuously as well. Regardless if we are talking about wildlife, plants, the natural resources access, or any kind of conservation projects, it is clear that this discussion of climate change and implicitly human mobility at its subsidiary effect has to be brought into this fora. The UNFCCC, the climate fora, does not do a very well job. I recently read about some projects on conservation which had some human rights violation, massive human rights violation in Amazon, and I saw the clear similarity between the Clean Development Program, which was belonging to UNFCCC under the Kyoto Protocol, which will be closed by 2020, where different projects of Annex 1 countries, of the Northern Hemisphere, more developed countries, were trying to implement in the countries affected by climate change. And they all brought this top-bottom approach. Top-bottom approach, going into the field, going in situ, and showing the indigenous people, showing the local people, showing the people who are facing and living this climate change event every day, how things should be done. And this is slowly changed by the Paris Agreement, which actually proposes a bottom-up approach. So the indigenous knowledge, it's actually mentioned in the preamble in the non-operational part of the Paris Agreement, which shows its importance in relation to addressing climate change. So I believe that this bottom-up approach should also be reflected in the conservation fora. And human mobility could actually, for example, we have a project in India working on big data and on human mobility, big data. And you can project very easily the migration patterns of the people, of one or two members of the household. How are they going to urban areas? They are sending remittances back home, where the climate change event, the typhoon appears, they disappear from that area, and then they are coming back. It's done by cell phones towers. So you can project very precisely where their position is. And I was thinking and making the comparison again with the wildlife, where you have the same technology available to do that, and how this one influences one another. Human mobility influencing conservation, and conservation influencing human mobility. I will stop here. I don't have something necessarily to tell you. I just wanted to show the link between the three, and secondly, to as a non-conservation expert, to encourage you to have this discussion on climate change and mobility in the conservation, to bring it up here, mainly because in the other forums it's lacking or is not reflected very well, except the Convention on Biodiversity, which it's a very political process which slowly moves forward. So thank you again for your attention. I apologize again for my burst in the room and coming out and everything. And I'm here for the rest of the event, and if you have any questions, I'm at your disposal. Thank you very much.
Very good, thank you. And I'm sure we all wish we could speak with that composure and calmness, having just had a 45-hour journey. Any questions? Yes, Bill. There's a microphone. Yes.
Thank you. The issue of displacement and immigration is just such huge issues, and don't need to tell anybody in this room how much it's even affecting, political agendas and national politics in so many different parts of the world. And I guess I just wanted to mention a couple points, which I'm sure you're aware of. But as you know, when we talk about issues like climate change, one of the things that we have much more difficulty trying to project into the future is rainfall, precipitation, than we do, for instance, temperature. And of course, we would, especially, my understanding is when one tries to come down in spatial scale, which is what we need to do. For instance, to know, how much southern Zimbabwe's grain production is going to be affected in the future. The models are abysmal. So that's a real interesting wild card and danger to me when you talk about climate change and how it's going to impact all these potential variables. But the other thing that I'm really struck by is all the international discussion, and from the United States to Europe to Australia, all over the world, people worrying about immigration and worrying about these issues, and yet not connecting the dots. Just for example, in Africa, current projections suggest that Africa's population is going to quadruple. And in Europe, of course, and I've spent enough time in Europe, and actually I was in sabbatical in Italy when they were being flooded with Middle Eastern and African immigrants under, the impacts are incredible. And yet project that 50 years into the future and ask what the impacts, and I guess to me, when we're talking about geopolitics here, if one starts connecting these dots, I guess I see some really scary changes about, one, not being able to predict rainfall, which hugely, probably the biggest factor that's going to influence food production and everything else, power generation and all that, but that we're not talking about the population issues. Well, we are talking about the population issues, but when we talk about immigration and all these political discussions, we're not then saying, why are we thinking about the next 2 years, the next election, and why aren't we thinking about the next 20, 30, 40 years, which then that's going to have an absolutely profound influence on these pressures and their political implications.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Although, as a lawyer, I'm trying to make a difference between politicians and the legal implications. You hear on TV a lot that the climate refugees, environmental refugees, just because politically it sounds more profound in the ears of the auditorium, but there is no such a thing from the legal perspective as a climate refugee or an environmental refugee, mainly because the Convention on Refugees from 1951 doesn't mention environment as a trigger. Simple like that. And this is where it is coming the difference between the political view of this climate change process in general, implicitly the mobility patterns, and when it's coming from the scientific perspective. The politicians have a tendency to think on a very short term because it makes sense for them. The elections are coming and we see it all over the world. It's a general trend, and from me as a lawyer it makes sense if you're a politician to do that. But as a scientist, we also discover the intergenerational connection. And the rainfall due to the high temperature is not only on food and water, but these migration fluxes at the end of the day should not be surprising to anyone. And sometimes we are trying to address that at the source, at the place of the sourcing for that migration patterns, especially the Europeans try to do that for the Northern African, unsuccessfully, because you don't have the means for addressing climate change on a short period of time. So this is probably, it will increase, the number of the migrants will increase, and this again for politicians will be, oh my God, yeah, it will create this hysteria we are all seeing on TV, but for the scientists should not be a surprise, and should try to tackle this process on a longer term, on 10, 20 years from now, and see that, again, to make a difference between the migration patterns and the displacement, to encourage and accommodate migration, and on the other hand, to try to tackle displacement as an effect of climate change. So, yeah, I totally agree.